There was a small door that led to the attic space in my bedroom, and it became a habit that I would shut the door as I walked into my bedroom a few times a week. I didn't think anything of it, and just assumed my mum didn't close it all the way when she left it. After a while I made the mistake of joking with her when she made a comment about me not picking up after myself, and I said something like, "Every night I have to close the attic door behind you, how about you shut it all the way when you're done?" She then informed me that she hadn't been in the attic for months. I asked my brother and my father. None of them had. So then I started to pay real close attention to it, making sure it was closed in the morning, checking it after school, and checking after dinner, then heading up to bed. And what do you know? It was open. After a few months of wondering, studying, experimenting, I thought I'd see what happened if I just didn't shut the door. I opened the door before school and checked it after school. Still open. Closed it after dinner. Still open. Before bed, still open. Now, I'm laying in bed, mind going crazy with the open door across the room. I decide to check it out, so I roll over and focus on the black space into the attic. That is when I see a face staring back at me. I bolt downstairs, wake my parents up, get ridiculed by my brother, and switch bedrooms with my brother and move into a new house about 6 months later due to an expanding household. And what do you know? My new physics teacher and his wife actually bought our house. I could have forgotten all about the events and chalked it up to me having an overactive imagination. But then, I had discovered in my senior year how awesome our physics teacher was, and it became my favorite class by far and favorite teacher. At the end of senior year, my friend and I took our VHS camcorder around, doing mostly silly things, but then took it to my old house to see what they'd done with the place. We got a very fun tour. I got to tell stories about all the projects my dad did that were still a part of the house. Then the wife led us upstairs and showed us the sewing room. So I jokingly ask, "Notice anything strange about this room?" And her face goes blank. On camera she asks what I mean, and I try to shrug it off but end up saying something about the attic door. She confirmed that every time she comes up to sew, it's open, and then tells us that the second day of being in the house, their dog, a German Shepherd, had gone into that room, but would not go back downstairs. He started barking and could not be consoled, then jumped through the window, landing on the tin roof over the porch and running off. The dog did not come back until the next day, and has not stepped foot into the hallway that leads upstairs since. I had the initial thought that I could show my parents and brother the story I had on film, but I decided to just let it be. The attic is the space in the house that runs parallel to the second floor, not above it. I was 11 to 12 when this was going on, so I did not immediately suss it all out. When I told my family that I saw a face, it was just my brother that ridiculed me. My father definitely would have checked for an actual human because of one of the first comments he made was about a family that recently had a coin collection stolen from their house across the street. The event itself was easy to shrug off, because I could have chalked it up to a lot of other possibilities. It wasn't until 5 years later that it became freaky. She confirmed that every time she comes up to sew, it's open, and then tells us that the second day of being in the house, their dog, a German Shepherd, had gone into that room, but would not go back downstairs. He started barking and could not be consoled, then jumped through the window, landing on the tin roof over the porch and running off. The dog did not come back until the next day, and has not stepped foot into the hallway that leads upstairs. This did not make me a believer in the paranormal. I told the story as a collection of details, not a confirmation of ghosts. But what it did do was never make me a non-believer. That face, it was expressionless, dimly lit, through a door smaller than a 2x4, with a knob that had to be turned in order to open it. I wish I still had the VHS. This was from over 25 years ago now, and I moved a lot after high school, and the tape sadly never made it through all those moves. I am the youngest of 4 brothers, all a year apart. At this time I was about 9, and our family friend was spending the night at our place. We lived in a 2-story house with a basement. At this time, my mother was single and dating a lot, so during this particular night, she was away. We saw how to make a Ouija board on this episode of a show called Mystery Hunters, a Canadian kids channel, YTV. So we decided it would be a fun thing to try, while we had the house to ourselves. So we cut up an old cardboard box and made a Ouija board from it. We put felt on the bottom of the triangle thing so that it would slide better, and it worked pretty well. We all tried putting our fingers on the triangle and asking questions, but got no response. Then me and my brother asked a question to the likes of, "Is there a demon here?" And the triangle started to move. We looked at each other and the expression on our faces showed that it was neither of us moving the triangle. We immediately got scared and ran into the kitchen. When we got there, we heard a crash come from the living room. It sounded like our TV fell off the wall unit. But when we ran back, we saw that nothing was wrong. After this, we decided to grab a Bible and read. The first words we read in unison were, "God's people are doomed." Frightened by this, we turned on the TV and saw it was Dave Chappelle, so we assumed it was going to be something funny. But when the audio began, the first words from Dave were, "And all the people died," to which the audience started laughing, and then it went to a commercial. Freaked out by both of these strange and unlikely things happening, the waterworks began, and we got up and ran upstairs crying and screaming to my brother's bedroom. When we got up the stairs and into his bedroom, we heard footsteps that sounded exactly like ours run up the stairs after us. Immediately I assumed it was one of my brothers or our friends late up the stairs. But then we realized we were all in the room and no one passed by the door. We began to panic, so we held each other, freaking out. It's hard to say if we heard anything after this point, so this was the last that happened for now. 2 hours later, me and my brother, the bravest of the 4, decided that this might be all in our heads, and that we would go play video games on my mum's computer in her office, Diablo 2 to be exact. The door to her office had no handle, so my brother pushed the door open, and immediately after he pushed the door, it slammed back on his arm, and all the way from the basement we heard clear and loud laughter. The only way I can describe it is it was the sound of a witch that echoed through the entire house. At this point we ran down the stairs, out the door into my grandmother's house, which was down the street, and waited for Mum to come home. I'm not sure if she completely believed us, but this was when we were kids. I'm 23 years old now, and this story sticks out as the only and craziest paranormal experience I have ever had. This happened to me a number of years ago. An altercation between my parents and I left me without a home. Don't worry, we're cool now. It was all my fault. Definitely shouldn't have brought those drugs into the house, but being a stupid 18-year-old with no money, I was desperate. However, being kicked out of the house put me towards the straight and narrow. I had to find a job, as at the time, I was just sitting at home playing Xbox for most of the day, to the point that my parents' frustration grew immensely. This is why this story happened in the first place. I needed to get a job, and a friend of mine worked at a local movie theatre and told me that they always needed staff. Their turnover was something insane. So I got in touch, and within 3 days he was giving me an interview. I show up, and he smirks at me, and we both just laugh in the interview room. He asks me some generic, chilled out questions, and at the end says, "Yeah, Brian, you got the job." It was more the formality than anything. And by the end of the week, I have my uniform and my rota, and I'm going to be paid eventually. I actually moved in with him for a few weeks just to get off my feet, and we were having the best of times at the movie theatre. There's not that much work to do, to be honest. It was a small town, and the movie theatre was the only one in town, so it was popular during the weekends, but during the weekdays, there wouldn't be much going on, especially not during the day. Now, this movie theatre was old. Really, really old. I want to say about 1910 or something like that. Point being, we had this dark and eerie basement at the bottom that housed all sorts of old things. It was creepy, and it had those lights that take ages to turn on. I used to call them the stagger lights. We go down the stairs to the basement every once in a while to store old movie posters, cardboard cutouts and things like that might be helpful in future, or that we may use as giveaways and prizes to keep sales in the theatre and have people come back. We're good like that. Don't just throw them all away. In any case, our trips down to the basement were frequent enough to make me afraid of it. It was dark, a little bit damp, and smelled. It always had this strange sensation, like I was being watched in the dark. To explain, it was a very big, dark room, right underneath one of the main theatres, with huge supporting pillars. It looked like a car park nearly. It was that big. At the edge, there was a small booth with a glass window. I still have no idea what was supposed to be there. Was that security? In any case, we didn't actually have security. Point being, this was just a very creepy place. Lots of old things, old boxes, and stuff that people had for the most part forgotten. After a few months of working there, I had gotten into the routine. I was actually quite a good worker, and me and my friends got along excellently, and the theatre was doing great business-wise. It was on one of these days where I didn't have much to do that my boss comes up to me and asks if I'd like to do a bit of overtime. Me, being young and hungry for money, asked him exactly what this entails, and he leads me down the stairs to the basement when I get a pang in my stomach. Oh no. He tells me that he wants me to organize and dispose of whatever we don't need here. That I need to make a list of everything we have, organize it, so that he can go through the list and let me know what is to be kept and what is not. And once that's done, for us to then organize what's left. He said he wasn't sure how long this whole thing would take, but that he would like me to stay overtime or before my shift started, whichever was convenient for me, and try and do as many hours as it took to sort this out. The pay for doing this task was quite good, and the fact that he hadn't told me how many hours it would take meant that I could go as fast or as slow as I wanted to, which is nice because it was such a chilled environment. So I started early one Friday afternoon, got into the theatre around 8, and being the only person in there, went down to the basement. I started looking through the boxes. Loads of old random stuff. Magazines from the town that we were featured in. Old posters. Old merchandise. Loads of things. I even found a really old projector. And I wondered if I could take it home if no one wanted it, or if it still worked. As I was going through the stuff, minding my own business, do I hear something from behind me? It was coming towards that funky little booth in the corner that I still didn't know what it was. I wondered if it could be a rat. I hate rodents of any kind, and didn't have anything to protect myself, so I grabbed the nearby broom and started quietly making my way over, seeing if I heard the noise any sooner. Just as I was about to reach that booth, do I hear a noise again, and I jump. It sounded like cans. Cans being stepped on or moved around. My head was hidden behind a pillar. As I composed myself, I moved over and peeked around the pillar. There was a pair of feet hanging outside the booth on the floor. I crept as quietly as possible to see who on earth is there. Was this one of my friends playing a prank on me? As I got closer, I saw the face of a disheveled-looking homeless man. He was asleep. He was twisting, and all around him were beer cans, Monster cans, old food, packets of Snickers and stuff. My eyes opened wide as I realized that this guy was not supposed to be here, and quietly made my way out of there while running as fast as I could. When I reached the top, I called my manager, who I actually woke, and asked him if he knew that there was a homeless guy in the basement. He immediately sobered up from his sleep and told me to call the cops immediately. The cops arrived, but when they did, the man was gone. I think it was all the commotion. That's when we realized that at the back of the little booth, there is actually a secret hole that leads to one of the theaters towards the back, and then you can just go out one of the fire exits. It was incredibly weird and disturbing. My manager said he understood if I didn't want the task, but as I really needed the money, I told him to give me a week to get over it and that I'd do it anyway. It took a whole 3 weeks in order to complete the task, but the basement was looking good again, and we made sure to seal off this hidden basement door. We removed the booth, and everything was fine. I quit shortly after though, finding a better job in another town, one with a career, and tried to make something of myself. I am glad that these events happened, as it put me on the right path. But to the homeless man hiding out in the basement of the movie theater, let's never meet again.
This happened 4 months after the birth of our beautiful baby girl. Our little girl was the sweetest, most gentle little newborn any new parent could have asked for. We named our little one after the month she was born in, May. May was born on a rainy night. I was the only one in labor on the entire floor that night. Like any new mother, I was exhausted after hours of labor. All I wanted to do was rest. My husband Matt looked after our little one while I rested a bit, but he eventually fell asleep too. I was laying in my bed watching my new family sleep peacefully when I felt a sudden urge to use the restroom. I called for my nurse, asking her to help me get up and walk over to the bathroom. After a few minutes, the nurse came in. I hushed her as she began speaking. I pointed to Matt, who was passed out on the sofa. The nurse and I quietly exited and began walking to the bathroom. As we were making our way back to my bed, another nurse came in carrying a small blanket. She walked in and began looking around. When my nurse asked her who she was looking for, her coworker looked confused. She began explaining to us as she was passing over to the nurse station. She walked past her room and saw a little girl with long black hair standing on her tiptoes, looking at her newborn baby girl. The nurse mentioned that the little girl was wearing a dress and assumed she might need a blanket since the room was chilly. I looked at my nurse confused and a little worried that someone else's kid could just walk into my room and look at my newborn without anybody but the nurse noticing. I quickly told her that May was my firstborn and that we weren't expecting any visitors. I asked if perhaps the little girl had gotten separated from her parents' room. However, my nurse was quick to mention that there were no other families at the moment with children on the floor. A few months after that, Matt and I moved into our new home. We were immediately welcomed by everyone, and we liked our new neighborhood. As we were unpacking and setting up May's room, I pulled out some baby monitors that we were planning on using now that May would be sleeping on her own. Matt and I were testing the baby monitors for a while. He was upstairs in May's room and I was downstairs in the kitchen. After a few successful tries, I began making dinner, leaving my baby monitor on the counter. I was cutting vegetables when I began to hear static on the monitor. Thinking it was Matt probably messing with it upstairs, I ignored it and turned it off. I walked over to the fridge when I heard a very faint voice. I walked over to the counter and picked up the monitor, pressing firmly against my ear. A very faint but identifiable noise was coming from the static. I realized right away it sounded like a young child's laughing. I turned around looking at May. She lay quietly on her swing, sleeping soundly. I turned back to the monitor, trying to make out the noise again, when suddenly it stopped. The lights on the monitor went down and stayed off. Matt came in the moment through the back door, carrying some tools from the shed. I asked him if he had taken the baby monitor with him outside. He looked at me and laughed at my strange question. He replied back saying that he had left the baby monitor upstairs a while ago. I began telling him what I had just heard. He shrugged it off and explained that it was most likely interference from another family's monitor. A few days after that, I decided to take May to the park. We left home and began making our way down the street when my next door neighbor stopped us. My next door neighbor was a sweet old lady. She began talking to May and asked me how everything was going. She was very good around May, and she held her excitedly and began telling me how nice it was to have a baby in the neighborhood. I asked her if there were any other children in the neighborhood, to which she quickly replied, no. Oh sweetheart, there haven't been any children here in a long time, but it's sure nice to finally have one around. She continued playing with May. As I began remembering the baby monitor static, I assumed that the monitor probably didn't work anymore, and told myself to remember later to tell Matt that we needed a new one, when she began talking again. She mentioned that she was always willing to babysit, in case Matt and I ever needed it. I thanked her for her offer, and began pushing May's stroller, when she suddenly turned towards me and replied, "Of course, dear. I can understand if you need a break. This little one has a mouth, doesn't she? I heard her cries all last night. I couldn't help but to think, what strong lungs she has." I looked at her confused, and began explaining that May always slept through the night, and cried very little. May certainly didn't cry loud or long enough for someone next door to hear. She nodded, then winked at me. She most likely thought that I was attempting to hide my embarrassment at being unable to control my crying baby, when she turned around and walked back to her house. That night, I told Matt what our neighbor had said. He laughed, saying exactly what I had earlier. May sleeps through the night, and hardly ever cries. That old lady is crazy, or probably missing her meds. I agreed, and asked him to replace the baby monitors before changing the conversation. The next day, Matt installed the new baby monitors before he left to work. May and I stayed home for the rest of the day. We left one baby monitor in May's room, another one in the bedroom, and another one in the kitchen. I was upstairs cleaning our room, which was directly across the hall and 2 doors away from May's, when I began hearing the static again. I walked over to my nightstand and sat in my bed, attempting to make out the sound from the baby monitor. I didn't hear May crying, but instead I heard the same laughter I heard with the previous monitor. I walked over to May's room carrying the monitor. Once again, she was sound asleep. May's monitor wasn't even playing anything. It stood on the dresser, silent. The lights didn't even turn on as I heard the laughter through the monitor I was carrying. Thinking it was strange, but not yet giving it to any paranormal explanation, I began walking downstairs to the kitchen when the sound suddenly stopped. I tried to shrug it off and continued cleaning, figuring that perhaps the area we live in made it easier to pick up sounds at a further distance. That night for dinner, I didn't tell Matt about the noise incident earlier that day. Matt seemed tired from work, and I didn't want to worry him with something that seemed like nonsense. A few nights after that, Matt and I were sleeping when I suddenly awoke. I was drenched in sweat and couldn't fall back to sleep. I decided to get up and go check on May. As I walked across the hall towards her room, I heard the static noise coming from downstairs. I stopped and pushed May's door open to make sure she wasn't awake, but sure enough, she was asleep as always. The static was coming from the kitchen. I knew it was coming from the monitor. Being sleepy and tired, I became annoyed and decided to go downstairs and shut it off. I entered the kitchen and turned the lights on, reaching for the monitor on the counter. I turned the monitor around, looking for a button to shut it off, when I realized it was already off. I stood there dumbfounded and placed it back on the counter, walking away thinking that perhaps I had imagined it when I heard the static again. I turned around immediately. The lights on the monitor were on. I walked over, getting ready to throw the monitor across the room, when the sound stopped again. There's a large trash bin next to the counter. It was one of those ones you would step on in order to flip up the lid. As I stood there, staring down at the monitor, I caught a glimpse of a reflection on the trash bin. For a few seconds I saw what looked like a small child. A little girl reflected on the trash bin, and directly behind me. I turned around terrified, expecting to see her. However, no one stood behind me. I looked around desperately, trying to find what had made the reflection, when the baby monitor in my hand had turned on again. The laughter was more clear. It was a child laughing and giggling. I dropped the monitor on the floor and darted upstairs towards May's room. More frightened than I had ever been in my entire life, I picked up May and took her to our bedroom. I woke up Matt, attempting to explain what I just heard. He woke up half asleep and went downstairs to check up on it. He came back upstairs a few minutes later, looking at me like I was crazy. He went back to bed and fell asleep immediately after. The next morning, May and I were out front on the porch, enjoying a beautiful day, when our neighbor came over. She looked worn out, nervous, and had black bags under her eyes. She wore pajamas, which were noticeably dirty. I greeted her, asking if she wanted any lemonade, before she interrupted me. She began saying how she hadn't been able to sleep well these past few days because of May's cries at night. I looked at her confused once again, and explained to her that May hadn't been crying at night. She started playing with her hands nervously and began saying that she could hear May screaming and crying every night. When she noticed I wasn't believing what she was telling me, her entire personality changed in an instant. She started yelling out profanity and telling me to, and I quote, "Take your little shit away from here and shut it the fuck up." Feeling threatened, I stood up and went over to May. While picking her up, I told the woman to leave. She stood there looking at May, angry and resentful. She kept yelling at us, startling May as she began to cry. I threatened her with calling the cops and kept telling her to leave before she finally decided to walk off. I went inside the house shaken up, and I felt upset that my neighbor would act in such a way where I felt threatened. I called Matt, asking him to leave work early, explaining what just happened. He immediately left the office and started heading home. As soon as he arrived home, I explained further what our neighbor had said. He became extremely upset. As he held May, we talked about what our neighbor had said regarding May's crying at night. He also didn't understand what our neighbor was talking about. May was a good baby. She hardly gave us any grief. As we were talking, we heard a knock on the door. Thinking that it was our next door neighbor again, Matt gave me May as he went to go see who was knocking. I let out a sigh of relief when our neighbor from across the street came in. Mr. Moss was one of the first friends we made when we moved here. Matt invited him to sit down and offered him something to drink. Mr. Moss politely declined, saying that he came over to talk to us about something very important. Matt and I sat down. I laid May on her swing, giving Mr. Moss my complete attention. He began explaining that earlier that morning, he had seen our next door neighbor come over and start screaming at me. He explained that for a few days now, our neighbor had been acting kinda strange, and he had noticed it when coming home from work. He mentioned that on one particular night, he pulled up to his house after working late and he noticed her outside. She was standing outside in her pajamas on the side of the house while looking up at the window above her. When I asked him for details on the window she was looking up at, he explained that it was the one on the second floor in the right corner of the house. I looked at Matt nervously as Mr. Moss described May's window. Matt held my hands tightly. Mr. Moss went on to explain that after he pulled up to the driveway, he noticed that she wasn't moving. He found it curious that she didn't even look to see what car it was. Not wanting to spook her, in case she hadn't noticed him, he went inside his house to continue some work he still had left. He said that he was working on his laptop for a couple hours before deciding to go to sleep. As he was turning off the lights, he looked out the window, noticing that my neighbor was still standing there staring up. He started fidgeting on the sofa while he spoke to us, as if what he was saying scared him. What he said next frightened me to the point of tears. This time she wasn't standing alone, he said. He saw what seemed to be a little girl standing behind her, looking at her. He estimated the little girl was probably no more than 5 years old. She was wearing a dress and had long black hair. He mentioned that while looking outside his window, he gasped a little, and at that exact moment, the girl slowly turned away from my neighbor and turned her head towards him. He said at that moment he was scared and immediately closed his blinds and laid in bed too frightened to go to sleep. I asked him if he went up to go look again, to which he replied no. Matt and I thanked him as he left the house. We looked at each other deeply concerned about what he just shared. After a few hours of discussion about potentially getting the police involved, Matt got up to use the bathroom. I sat there completely lost in thought when I began hearing the baby monitor from the kitchen again. I stood up and ran to the kitchen. I stared at it while the familiar static slowly cleared to laughter. I picked up the monitor and ran towards the bathroom, pressing it firmly against the door, yelling at Matt to come out. He opened the door, asking what was wrong. When he stopped to hear the laughter playing on the monitor, I gave the baby monitor to him as we ran upstairs to May's room. We had put her to sleep upstairs after she passed out on her swing. We ran inside her room, nervous and scared, when we saw that she still lay there, sleeping in her crib. We looked at each other confused. The monitor he was holding suddenly went silent from the static. I stared at it before turning it around and shutting it off. We stood there in silence, attempting to rationalize what just happened, when the monitor in our bedroom turned on and began letting out that same laughter we just heard. The door was open and the baby monitor stood on my nightstand. Matt and I could see it clearly from May's room. The laughter got louder and louder as it suddenly started playing on all 3 monitors. I picked up May, scared and crying at the same time. Matt held me as he dropped the monitor he was holding. The laughter went from child's laughter to something that sounded completely demonic. Right as we began running out of the room, the voice let out one last piercing scream. It screamed, "Cry." As soon as it said that, we heard a gunshot that sounded like it came from next door. May woke up and began crying at the chaos in her room. Matt and I were getting ready to make a run for it when the laughter suddenly stopped. We ran out as fast as we could. Other neighbors started coming out of their homes, getting ready to investigate the gunshot. We bumped into Mr. Moss, waiting for the police to arrive, when 2 men decided to go inside our next door neighbor's house to investigate. After a few minutes, one immediately came running out yelling, "We need an ambulance!" After about an hour of standing outside, Matt and I were still too afraid to go back inside for our car keys. We waited outside among all the police officers and Mr. Moss, hoping to overhear what had happened. A short, stubby lady that lived a few houses down came up to us explaining that she just overheard one of the men who had gone in to investigate. She said that the men found our next door neighbor's body sitting in a chair, looking directly out the window with a gunshot wound in her head. I stood there stunned to hear that she decided to take her own life. When the lady continued speaking, she said that the gun was on the 2nd floor and that she had cuts all over her arms which seemed to be self-inflicted. She went on to explain, directly behind her on the wall, she had spelt out, "She won't stop crying," in her own blood. Matt and I left the majority of things at that house. We moved across the country and kept in contact with only Mr. Moss over the years. We wanted to leave everything behind us and start a new life with May. Nothing paranormal happened to us for years, and we were perfectly happy to move on. May is now 5 years old. She's a brilliant, curious, happy, and a loving child. Matt needed a few things from our storage this week and brought some old boxes home. This morning, May came into the kitchen, excited and attempting to get my attention as I was putting away the dishes. I had my back turned on her as she kept repeating, "Mama, girl, she's funny. Mama, she's laughing." I finally turned around thinking that she was talking about her playdate next door when I dropped the plate I was holding on the floor. The plate shattered on the floor, as did my heart when I saw what my little girl was holding up next to her ear. May was holding up one of the old baby monitors from the old house, and on it, I could hear a child's laughter.
I'm not one to believe in paranormal or spirits, but this happened and I don't know how to explain it. I was walking with my friend Dale trick-or-treating, as well as some kids that were my mum's friends' kids. We were walking near a small bridge to get to an island known as Seabrook Island. It's a small neighborhood but higher middle class, and I know the area like the back of my hand. As we're approaching the bridge, we hear one of the other kids scream. We turn around, and in an instant, the kids were gone. The decoration and the whole surrounding area had all their lights turned out. It was as if in an instant, we were warped into a different dimension. We shouted to see where the kids went, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Feeling anxious, we started running around. The neighborhood didn't look like itself, and eventually, we reached a park with a green ladder and metal slide on a concrete floor. As I mentioned, I know this area extremely well, and as far as I know, this park does not exist. We kept leaving the park, but no matter how or where we went, we always ended up winding back here. It was after a while that we realized we had our phones with us. I pulled mine out, but my contacts were blank. What the hell is going on? I punched in my mum's number manually, and right as I went to hit the call button, the phone turned off. I was getting extremely scared. There was nothing I could do. We walked around and eventually led back to the park. A man was there, and we asked him desperately to make a call on our behalf to my mother because we were lost, scared, and frightened. The man, however, gave no useful reply. He was speaking gibberish, or at least it was gibberish to me. I don't know which language it was. And when he showed me his phone screen, after painstakingly communicating with hand gestures that we needed to ring someone, I saw that his phone screen was cracked and unresponsive to the touch, so effectively useless, and it just displayed the time with a black screen. Great. We left the man and continued trying to find our way out. After what felt like forever, something happened and I felt my phone turn on in my pocket. I looked down and it was 12:01. And just like that, we suddenly recognized the neighborhood we were in. Lights were illuminating houses, and we quickly made our way back to my house. It was very late. I wondered what had happened to the other kids, but I was sure they made their way home safely. Dale went back to his house, and I to my own. I threw myself into bed and passed out. In the morning I woke up, and Dale was on the floor, asleep. This has been a very confusing night. I'm not sure what's caused this, but it has creeped me out beyond measure.
It was around Halloween of 2017 that our 4-year-old son introduced us to Blue Mommy. He had learned to talk about 6 months prior, but it was mostly just nonsense talk for a while. That is, until he introduced us to Blue Mommy. At first, we figured it was just an imaginary friend or something, or like a way to make me jealous by claiming he had 2 mommies. We weren't entirely sure, but it was only when we began to ask more about Blue Mommy that me and my husband started to get a little creeped out. According to him, Blue Mommy was almost exactly like me in every way, except for a few key differences. Blue Mommy has all blue skin with long dark hair and all white eyes. We knew that because we asked him to draw her for us one time. Blue Mommy also picked him out of his crib at night and then turned off all the lights without ever having to touch any of the switches. And the thing that really got our attention was when he told us that Blue Mommy's arms and head are covered in bandages because she has a lot of boo-boos. And for those of you that are unaware, boo-boo is what we called any kind of graze or cut. He added that Blue Mommy never, ever smiles, but we later determined this was because she had no mouth. He also told us that Blue Mommy could take her head off and it would still talk like there was nothing wrong. It also happened to be the case that Blue Mommy really didn't like Daddy, and the way our son said it with this big, wide smile was honestly one of the creepiest things I'd ever heard. He told us all this stuff for maybe a year or a little more, and then it suddenly just stopped. If we ever asked where she was, our son would always point to the same spot, a corner of the room behind his open closet door. He would also wake up crying almost every night during this time, and once during a really rough night, my husband went in to ask him what was wrong, and his answer was, "Blue Mommy won't let me sleep." Obviously, this was greatly concerning for us, and me and my husband took him to a variety of child psychologists and therapists who thankfully assured us that his behavior was perfectly normal for a boy his age. Some kids have an overactive imagination, only they can't distinguish between what's real and things they've just made up. So as much as there really was no such thing as Blue Mommy, and I won't have a bunch of cranks telling me it was a ghost or whatever, it didn't mean our son wasn't actually suffering in some way. Thankfully, he grew out of the habit, like I might have mentioned, and we moved on to the next child-rearing hurdle that faced us. We laughed about it these days and say stuff like, you know how kids say the funniest things? Well, kids can say the creepiest stuff, too. Last year, 2018, was a very busy year for me, meaning that I had little to no time to date or meet any girls. Due to my busy schedule, I decided to make a Tinder account. I have never had any experience with such an app or online dating, and I didn't actually plan on meeting up with a random girl to go on a blind date or anything. I just wanted to see what the fuss was about and if it actually worked. So the app, still being something new to me, I matched with this really pretty girl. She seemed short, light-skinned, and had a nice smile. Her account wasn't a catfish or any sort of fake profile, it seemed genuine and legit. I know that I didn't actually want to hit it off with any girl in this manner, but she was very hot and I said, screw it. So I slid into her DMs with a simple, hey. A couple of hours went by and we got each other's Snapchat usernames and phone numbers. We exchanged Snapchat photos, so with that said, there's no way that her Tinder account was fake. I felt better knowing that for some reason. She said that she lived in the city that was about 25 to 30 miles north of mine. I had nothing planned for the next day, and neither did she, so we decided to meet up at her house the next day to mess around. The next day came by, and we planned to meet up at around 10:30. The neighboring city where she was from was about a 30 to 45-minute drive from my place, so around 10 p.m.-ish. I decided to start driving over. As I am driving over, I get a phone call from her telling me to instead go over at a later time, around midnight. I didn't mind, since I had friends who lived in her city, so I paid them a visit. Meanwhile, I waited for her. 11:45 p.m. rolled by and I started to drive to her place. My friends didn't know what I was up to, they just thought I popped in to visit them randomly. So this girl sends me her address, and at first the address that she had sent me led me to this upper-class suburban neighborhood. I reached the address and it was close to what I would describe as a white mansion. I called her to tell her that I was parked in her driveway, and I asked her to come outside so I could assure myself that I was at the right place. She said, "I don't see you. Are you sure you followed the directions?" Well, to avoid any more mess-ups, she just sent me her current location through iMessage. At first, I found it odd, but I followed the directions to the location anyway. So midnight rolled by and I was on my way to her current location, which was actually kind of far from the address that she had originally sent me. As I am driving, the directions are telling me to drive off the path and into a dirt road surrounded by cornfields. This spooked me a little because I was now in the middle of nowhere. I was about 10 minutes away from any civilization. Red flags started to go off in my head, but I ignored them because there was no way that her account could have been a setup. I've seen her pictures on Snapchat, and you can't Photoshop those as far as I'm aware. So after driving through a dark dirt road through the cornfields, the directions led me to a broken down old house. It looked uninhabitable. There were no cars outside or in the driveway, and the only light I saw was the porch light. I called this girl to tell her that I was outside. She replies with, "Okay, I'll be right out." On a side note, I'm a pretty big dude and I train every day. I'm not intimidated by others, but there are some situations where you are helpless and have no option but to evade for the fear of your life. So I'm waiting by my car, and then I see this figure come out the front door, and it was dressed like a freaking nun. Black veil, long black dress, voodoo charms, and she's also holding a voodoo doll on her left hand. I was pretty spooked out, but I thought it was just a prank. I gave it a few seconds for the cameras to pop out, but the person just stood there. I slowly started to realize that this wasn't a prank because a few seconds later, I saw another figure in a similar black outfit peeking out of a door and starting to make a run towards me with an actual machete. I don't even bother trying to fight back because I knew I was probably going to end up gutted or skinned alive by these psychos. I immediately jump in the car and floor it out of there. I then heard a gunshot a few seconds later behind me. I'm in my car screaming prayers with tears in my eyes because I was hoping to drive away with my life. Her number then kept calling me as soon as I left. I blocked it, and then another number started to call me, and I blocked it as well. I ended up staying over at a friend's house that night. I explained everything that took place, and he wanted to go check it out together with our group of friends, but I was too terrified to even go back there. I called the police, and they went to go check it out, but the place was abandoned by the time they got there. They said that the address has been vacant for years, and they simply made a report out of it, and they were never found. The whole thing was a sick setup to begin with. The girl was planning on luring me so they could do God knows what to me. I deleted my Tinder account. I'm pretty sure it works if you're only looking to get laid, but I somehow had the worst luck the first time I ever decided to use it. Don't ever meet a stranger somewhere that isn't public. Things can always go sideways. The traumatizing events of this story happened to me several years ago. This is the first time I'm sharing my story publicly in hopes it may help others who read it. At the time, I was a mother of a 4-year-old daughter. Her name is Juniper, and she is my entire life. The day of these events, my husband was at work, so I decided to do some Christmas shopping at the mall. On the way in, Juniper saw Santa sitting in the middle of the atrium and began jumping because I assumed she associated Santa with presents. We decided to get into line, even though it was long. We could get a picture and she could tell Santa what she wanted for Christmas. When it was finally Juniper's chance to sit on his lap, I immediately felt uncomfortable. I didn't like the way he was staring at her. His eyes were big and looked as if though he had been on something. She sat there for a moment and told the man what she wanted as I watched, filled with anxiety. After about 2 minutes, he got her off his lap and winked goodbye to her and said Merry Christmas. Happy this ordeal was over, we did the little bit of shopping we had to do and pressed on through the day. While I was browsing around one of the clothing stores, I looked up and thought I noticed the mall Santa sitting outside of the store we were in. Not taking any chances, I grabbed Juniper and walked out of the other entrance of the store. After a little while longer of shopping, we decided to get some lunch in the food court of the mall. I kept my eyes peeled because I just had Mother's intuition that something wasn't right. We were finishing our food, and literally as we were about to get up, the mall Santa came over to our table. He walked right up to Juniper and said in a jolly Santa-like voice, "Hey there, Juniper. Remember to be good so Santa can come and bring you lots of presents." She was so excited, and so were all the people around me. It's easy to say what you would do in that situation, but I just stood still. I thought freaking out my daughter and rushing her away from Santa would be a traumatizing event, so I grabbed her hand and told her it was time to go. She said goodbye to Santa, and we left. That night at home, I told my husband about the entire story. He was angry, but agreed with my course of action. The next day, I woke up at about 8 a.m. My husband was already gone for work for the day. I happened to look outside and saw a strange blue car that I had never noticed parked outside my house. This didn't really bother me considering it could have been anyone, but it was just peculiar. At about 11 a.m., I looked out the window again and noticed the car was still in the exact same spot. I made the choice to go out to my mailbox in the front of my home and investigate the car. The car was empty, except for the passenger seat. There was a Santa hat on the seat. I tried not to jump to any conclusions, but it was just starting to make too much sense in my head. I ran inside and called my husband. He said I was grasping at straws, but decided to come home anyway to make sure I was okay. A couple of minutes later, my worst fear was realized. I looked out the window and saw the man in his car. It was the mall Santa, and he was taking a picture of my house with his cell phone. Once he saw me, he drove away, and he drove away so fast I couldn't get the license plate number. Minutes later, my husband came home and I explained what I saw. We called the authorities, but there really wasn't anything that could be done. I felt angry with myself that I looked at the car all morning and couldn't get a license plate number. My husband stayed home from work the next day just in case. At about noon, we walked around the house and noticed footprints outside of Juniper's window. Footprints in the snow that neither of us left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt like I was just waiting for something horrible to happen. My husband, Juniper, and I all decided to have a camp out in the living room so she could be with us all night. It was the mall Santa car from the day before, and he was approaching the house with a giant bag in his hand. I called the police as my husband stalked him through the windows. The lights were off, so the mall Santa couldn't see us through the windows. He made his way all the way to Juniper's window. He started to tap on the windows, almost as if though he was trying to wake her up. My husband stood on the other side of the window, trying not to scare him away until the cops came. That's when we heard it. "Hey, Juniper, it's Santa. Come take a ride in my sleigh and I'll show you the reindeer." Praying that the cops would show up any minute, I sat in the fetal position, not knowing if this lunatic had a gun or any other weapon. He kept tapping and whispering, "It's me, Santa." Finally, the cops showed up, and when we heard the sirens out front, my husband jumped out the window and tackled the mall Santa. My husband yelled for the cops, and the cops detained the man. He didn't have any weapons on him, but his car did have duct tape and rope. It gives me nightmares to this day, thinking of that horrible situation and what could have happened. My Christmas miracle is that my family is safe, and my daughter didn't have to really experience any of the intense feelings my husband and I did over those couple of days. If you as a parent have instincts about the safety of your child, please follow them. If I would have just left the mall when I felt uneasy, I could have possibly avoided this entire series of events. The events of this story happened several years ago. During the course of that year, I lived overseas. My company had a branch in Europe, and I decided I would work there for a year or so. For the most part, it was beautiful, and I had a really great time, learning the culture and meeting new people. But during the holiday time, especially around Christmas, it could get very lonely and made me homesick. My family and friends still lived back in the United States and could not afford to come see me, and because of my job, I was stuck in Europe for the time being. On Christmas, I stayed home in my apartment and decided to watch movies. After watching Netflix for a couple of hours, I got bored and was looking for something to entertain me for a while. Quick backstory about me: when I was in high school, my friends and I used to crack the surface of the so-called dark web or deep web. We were all pretty computer savvy and thought we were cool being able to access it at a young age. We didn't do anything besides just surf around, as we were scared to stumble across something we shouldn't. Well, fast forward back to the present, and I haven't done anything like that in close to 10 years. But I decided searching the dark web was just the excitement I was looking for on this quiet Christmas evening. It honestly seemed pretty harmless, and I thought, what could go wrong? I searched through dozens of dead-end links and pages, and nothing really seemed to spark my interest. After an hour or so of surfing, I decided it was finally time for bed. I closed everything down on my computer and went to the bathroom. When I came out, I noticed my webcam screen was up. Being a little naive, I didn't think anything of it and just closed it out. As I turned away, it popped up again. As I stood and watched for several seconds trying to comprehend what was happening, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from a private number that said, "I see you." Beyond creeped out and starting to get worried, I decided to shut off my lights and turn the computer off. But before I could, I had an email pop up on my desktop. The email was a picture of my apartment building. I unplugged my computer and grabbed a knife from my kitchen and stood in the corner of my apartment. Almost immediately after unplugging the computer, another text came through that said, "I hope your doors are locked." I couldn't comprehend what was happening. I was frozen in both shock and fear. All I could think of was something happened while I was on the dark web, and I wasn't sure what. For hours, I stood in my dark apartment staring at the windows and doors. Every little noise made me jump out of my skin. Every time I heard somebody in the hall, I was getting myself ready for self-defense. Now this was Christmas night and the middle of the night at this point. There was no way there should be that much foot traffic in the hallway, but I heard it. Back and forth, I heard footsteps all night long, but never anybody actually standing in front of or knocking at my door. Morning finally came and I still had not slept and hardly moved all night. At about 8:30, somebody knocked on my door. I slowly approached the door, not knowing at all what to expect. As I looked through the peephole, I noticed it was my neighbor. I opened the door and greeted him. "I hope you had a Merry Christmas," he said to me in an almost excited voice. I just nodded and said, "You too." In his cheerful morning voice, he then said, "Somebody dropped this letter off to me this morning and said it was for you, but they said they couldn't talk to you for some reason." I took the letter, knowing deep down where it truly came from. I asked, "What did he look like?" And he responded with, "Well, he was actually a she. She was pretty, dark hair, pretty smile." I said thanks and shut the door. Standing right there, I opened the letter. It was a Christmas card with Santa on the front, and the inside of the card was written as follows. It started with my name, my full name, and then read as followed. "I hope you had a nice Christmas. I am sad you never came out in the hall to meet me and my friends. I guess there is always next year. Happy Christmas." I left right at that moment. I grabbed the few things I needed and checked into a hotel. I stayed a couple of nights and returned back to the States and told my bosses I was having some sort of medical emergency and that I felt more comfortable finishing out my contract in the States. I never contacted the police and have also never been so scared in my entire life. Every single time I get on the internet, I get a little shaky and only use it for my job and not personal use. Nothing like this has happened to me again in the years since, and thankfully, no follow-ups to this single occurrence. I still can't help but wonder what I strolled upon that night when I was targeted. If I can leave you with a bit of advice, don't be a novice strolling around the dark web, especially on Christmas.